Contrary to much popular belief, liberals are just as intolerant as conservatives. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Geoffrey Wetherell from Valparaiso University joins me in examining political bias, personality traits, and levels of tolerance and intolerance that may contribute to either a tribal society or a civil society. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Geoffrey Wetherell. We're going to discuss political bias and intolerance, topics timely for the world we live in. Dr. Wetherell got his Ph.D. at DePaul and now teaches at Valparaiso University, has been doing a lot of work on intolerance and tolerance and measuring the different political tendencies and how those stack up, including the articles and chapters recently on something called the ideology conflict hypothesis.
The ideological conflict hypothesis.
Maybe
yes.
we should start with that. Explain to us what the ideological conflict hypothesis is.
Okay, well, the ideological conflict hypothesis is based on the idea that as human beings, we all have value systems. So these value systems are about our political beliefs or our moral beliefs or our religious beliefs, and we use our value systems to orient ourselves to the world in ways that can make the world predictable and that can also make our lives feel purposeful. And across the ideological divide, folks often tend to focus on different value systems. And when we perceive people as violating our value systems, we often experience feelings of prejudice towards them and oftentimes want to engage in discriminatory actions towards them.
Does that mean that once we get a value system, whether it comes from a culture or it defines the culture, that we tend to stay in that value system environment?
Yes, so are you talking about geographical locale?
Well,
or are you
I guess
talking about ideological locale, so to speak?
That would be my question. I mean, it would seem like sometimes it could be a geographical, particularly if it was religious. Like I'm more apt to be Mormon in Utah,
Yes.
and I'm more apt to be Southern Baptist but it isn't necessarily geographic. I guess it could be another form of identity with values that I have.
We tend to gravitate towards people who share our ideologies in terms of our values, and we often, research suggests, tend to potentially gravitate to places where people tend to hold our values as well.
Oh, so we'd even move.
So if you look at the coasts, for example, most people are voting Democrat on the coast. If you look at the center of the country, they're not. And the particular...
Because we're better Americans.
Sure. And the particular personality traits that seem to be more typical to conservatives seems, according to some at least, to potentially lead them to gravitate towards something like a smaller town environment, for example, whereas people who are high in things like openness to experience, like liberals are, and this has been shown in the research literature, tend to seek out places where they can have new experiences like big cities.
Larger cities.
So geographically, there's some evidence that has been presented by people like Jonathan Haidt that suggests that this might be the case. And just according to a social psychological perspective, we tend to gravitate to similar people. We tend to marry people who are like us in a lot of ways. Same socioeconomic status, same kinds of belief systems. There's even research that suggests that equal levels of perceived attractiveness are fairly common among spouses, for example. So we tend to really want to gravitate towards people that can make us feel that our value systems are right, and we can feel that our viewpoints are safe within a group that share those kinds of common values.
A certain familiarity makes us comfortable, and you would tend to gravitate towards that.
Exactly.
Unless somebody's personality is that they find something that's familiar to be boring and they seek out other experiences, which is what you're saying one of the characteristics of at least people that live in big cities or
Correct.
choose to live in big cities.
Yeah, so there's a trait called openness to experience that seems to be higher among liberal people. So openness to experience would predict things like trying new foods or going to art museums that have a variety of art, including potentially bizarre and abstract art. So this particular trait seems to be higher among liberal individuals than conservative individuals.
I'm sorry I interrupted you before because we were talking about the ideological conflict hypothesis, which comes from I understand it comes from our values. So we have certain values, and then the question is, how do these values present themselves in our behavior and our willingness to talk or entertain talking with other people?
Right. So as I've mentioned, our value systems are really important to us, and they constitute to a good degree our sense of personal identity. And when we see people as violating those values, we often feel that what they're doing is wrong or incorrect, and we think less of them. And when we think less of people in these sorts of ways, we are often willing to try to defend our value systems by endorsing or engaging in harmful or detrimental behavior towards them. It can be verbally, it could be physical in more extreme circumstances, but when we see those values as violated, regardless of who we are, we feel defensive, and it can put us on the offensive for that reason. Yep.
So in chapters that I read and in the one article in Current Directions in Psychological Science, the ideological conflict hypothesis was looking at what's traditionally called liberals and conservatives. And the traditional belief, at least among liberals, is that conservatives tend to be more intolerant. But your work with colleagues discovered that that wasn't to be so.
Sure. So in a study we ran in 2013 at DePaul, what we did is we asked both liberals and conservatives the extent to which they felt a variety of groups that are typically associated with the left or the right violate their core values and convictions. And then we asked them to rate the extent that they were willing to engage in or endorse particular discriminatory behaviors against those target groups. So these were things like, I think that target group shouldn't be allowed to give a speech in public, so that would be a form of political discrimination that deals with one's constitutional rights. And we had some other non-political items like target group deserves whatever suffering that they experience, or I could see in some cases how it might be justifiable to vandalize or deface target group's property.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these were the same questions and same responses for whether people self-identified as liberal or conservative, or did you do something prior to that to put them in categories?
No, it was a self-identification measure of liberalism and conservatism. We measured it in two ways. It was social conservatism and economic conservatism, so 1 being liberal, 7 being conservative, 2 scales, we averaged them together. And what you find, and we use the same items for the target groups.
Okay.
So what we found is that conservatives tend to see groups that are typically associated with conservatism as violating their conservative values less than the groups that are associated with liberalism. We get the flip, the exact opposite for liberals, and we get that same pattern for the discrimination items. And those differences statistically can be explained by the extent to which the participants felt that the groups who either supported or opposed them violate these particular core values and convictions.
And I'm assuming the study was based upon attitudes and beliefs, not actions.
In what sense?
Well, for instance, now on many college campuses they have free speech zones, or they have safe zones, and hate speech is not allowed, and it's like that's the level of civility or constitutional right to speak, which would be different than I'm tolerant towards a group that will come on campus and burn my building or burn a cross on the campus, which is different than being able to speak in a classroom or being able to have a beer at the same bar that you're at. So you were looking not at the actions per se or the behaviors, just the attitudes of whether or not you thought you could associate with.
Yes, so you're talking about the dependent measures, so the endorsement of potential discriminatory behaviors, and yes, we can't assess that, of course, in real time because it'd be highly unethical.
Well, even beyond that, for instance, someone might say that I'm in favor of someone that I don't agree with that thinks, there should be a wall built to keep Mexicans out, like that's a typical thing today. And so you might be willing to say, okay, I entertain the right, that person should be able to speak, we should have a discussion, versus somebody who says, no, they shouldn't, right, because they're just racist. Yeah. I'm saying is the person that thinks there should be a wall also thinks that what we should do is physically round up all Mexican-American looking students on campus and put them in a van and take them back where they came from, which I'm suggesting is beyond the attitude and beyond the tolerance, because it's not tolerant of a point of view, it's tolerance of a behavior that...
Sure, so what we were really trying to assess with those dependent measures, at least with the speech items, is the basic ability for a person to speak out in society and make a particular argument. So it was participants' level of endorsement of this particular democratic ideal.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
One of the other things that came up when I was reading was how individuals, whether they self-identify as liberal or conservative, make judgments about other people, which is based upon selective perception. So if I think this other person is a conservative and I'm a conservative, they may espouse something that I don't necessarily agree with, but my selective perception will kind of tamp that down. Is that fair?
Potentially. And can you define in a little bit greater detail the concept of selective perception?
Well, you're my guest, so I don't want to get I don't want to get lost. But the idea is that depending on my belief or what I'm comfortable with, I will probably seek out things that confirm that. If I hear something that's opposed to my belief, I probably won't.
Exactly, yeah. So in social psychology, we call that confirmation bias. We seek out evidence that upholds our current views, and we tend to discount evidence that doesn't. So if you want to know something is true, what you might do is go into Google and type in the exact thought that I would like to believe, and then find all of the evidence that you're correct.
Journalists often do that.
Sure.
So the question is, I have a belief system or I have a value system, and I find people that may or may not agree with my entire value system. But if they're close enough, I will accept behavior that I may not accept in somebody that I don't agree with, such that in a world where I'm in Hungary and I may not like Orban, the president of Hungary, because I think he's extremely racist, but that doesn't register for me if I'm more concerned about Syrian refugees come in, so I just don't notice the other things, which I don't know what the consequence of that is, but it seems to be embedded into this tolerance and intolerance.
Sure, so absolutely. So in terms of the way that we actually act out based on our value systems, and if you combine it with things like confirmation bias, I think it's relatively easy to predict that people might end up even violating their own ideals in defense of a particular set of values. So if you're a person who values free speech or tolerance, for example, and you see a group as violating free speech or tolerance, then you might be relatively intolerant of them, and you might want to tamp down on their right to speech, and you might even become violent towards them, depending on the particular social situation that you're embedded in. So our morals and our values can really put blinders on us with regards to whether or not we're following our own internalized standards.
And where's the guide for that? Is there, I mean, I may be jumping ahead, but is there any outcome from what your findings? Like, where's the guide to, like, pull somebody's coattail that says, hey, you know, what would Jesus do? Or what's the other phrases? It's like, you're violating your own belief here. Who raises that?
Sure. Well, I think that, you know, we have a fairly polarized political situation going on right now, and I think that one thing that we could probably all benefit from a little bit is to give people the benefit of the doubt a little bit more. I think that just from my own observations, it seems that we view the electorate as a dichotomy, and there's liberals and conservatives, and the liberals tend to think that the conservatives are rather extreme. The conservatives tend to think that the liberals are rather extreme, and this has been demonstrated in research. And we tend
and they could both be right.
Well, about some things, right? Yes. I mean, both of them are certainly correct about certain things, and people's views are often very nuanced. But when we're thinking in terms of these sorts of moral values and judgments, we often tend to see people as very simple units with simple, cohesive belief systems, and they're not. And so I think that that would be something in this day and age that we could probably all learn from pretty well. I mean, there's an interesting paper that I just read about hidden tribes, and what these researchers did is they used something called a cluster analysis. So they asked a variety of participants about their ideological beliefs, and then they created a statistical model that sort of moves people into categories based on what their beliefs are. And they came up with like 8 different clusters with regards to, you know, the specific typologies, just to try to simplify it a little bit, that exist in the American electorate. And only on the very fringes do people seem to be particularly extreme in their beliefs. So many conservatives, many liberals, many centrists are all actually very reasonable people, and I think that...
And they may share some fundamental values that aren't necessarily triggered by political rhetoric or some other
Absolutely.
ethnic-based rhetoric.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think many people actually have a great deal of shared values between them. I mean, if you look at, there's a group called moderates in that, and it looks to me like they lean a tiny bit to the right, and then you have a group called traditional liberals, and they differ around the margins in terms of what they believe, but overall I think that those two groups, in terms of sort of liberal democratic ideals, like some of the ones that we've brought up, have a lot of common ground that they could use to try to discuss issues and move things forward.
One thing that's always bothered me is to the acceptance of these concepts, liberal and conservative, that apply to the larger political system. And what you started to uncover here is that most people don't fall into one or other of these except when there's an election or whenever there's something that's presented. Well, pragmatically, you have to make this choice. But when you get down to some basic questions like, should people have enough money to right, if you're working, should you get a decent wage? Should you be able to live in a less than substandard, a better than a substandard house? Should your education, those things, education, income, equal rights, seem to be across the board. Whether they're called deplorables or whether they're called snowflakes, there's the same basis. But by getting caught up into this liberal and conservative, what do you call them, pods or?
Well, the paper that I wrote is called Hidden Tribes. So people are tribal in nature. We've evolved to be that way. But I think we're seeing each other rather dichotomously at the moment.
And that's one thing I'd like to move from. I mean, I think what you're finding is very informative, and more people should know this, that there's nobody has a purchase on being tolerant, and nobody is exclusively intolerant, but this spans the spectrum. But when I was reading, one thing that what strikes me is that at what point do we get to the content? If we move from the variable that there's ideology A, B, and C, at what point do we get to the content? We were talking earlier, and my example was, right, a slave master may be prejudiced, biased, and intolerant of slaves running away. On the other hand, slaves are intolerant of being chained and whipped, and at that point I would argue that the intolerance on one is probably preferable or more justifiable than the tolerance of the others. So it's, I guess the question is, at what point do we get to talk about content once we get away from what we should be tolerant of?
Sure. So is the question you're asking, is there a line where if a person crosses it, we should no longer consider fighting back against it to be indicative of intolerance? Is that essentially what you're asking?
Or to say at some points intolerance is actually the preferred response?
Well, I think that we have a legal system, and nowadays if you were to enslave a person and chain them and whip them, you would be severely punished, and I think that's for very good reason. So there are many things that we as a society can consider to be unlawful or wrong, and I think that that's the right thing to do. The research that I've done focuses largely on our beliefs and value systems, and the kind of dependent variables that we're looking at tend to be tolerance of things like free speech, for example. But I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, there are things that violate people's human rights, and I think that in societies like ours, we need to make sure to safeguard those rights.
Because even when we talk about law and what's legal, it seems like the reason we got to that law, because at a certain point, sufficient number of citizens no longer would tolerate this behavior, that becomes a law, which then establishes the norm that you have to work your way around one way or the other. So the law by itself, to me, would not be that's not my litmus test,
Absolutely.
so to speak. The law more reflects what was previously intolerable.
Yes, and so I think this is kind of a nice bridge. So your question bridges nicely what we've been discussing. So in order to have a discussion about what to put into law, what you need to do is you need to be able to have a discussion with people who think differently than you. Otherwise, you get into a situation where every Congress tries to remove every speck of progress from the last Congress, right? If you can never agree with one another and you can never come to a consensus. And I think what I'm really interested in with my research is how these value systems that imbue our lives with such a sense of predictability and meaning can lead us to see other people in the dichotomous way that I've described, to see them as innately bad people, and to not be willing to talk to them, even when actually many of them are completely reasonable people. And if we are intolerant to one another, or we are not at least willing to accept other people's points of view,
which I would argue,
it's hard to craft legislation, right?
So even to craft a conversation.
Exactly.
If I'm convinced that I am right, or you are convinced you are right, then I would say it would be preferable to engage in a conversation with somebody else, because then we would be able to demonstrate the rightness of one position or another. You should relish those opportunities to demonstrate this, or to tweak it as the case might be, because I think that's, I mean, all of history suggests that there is nobody that has a purchase on rightness or wisdom or intelligence or any of these other things, and we kind of get led astray with that. Is there any relationship between personality types or cognition, or that you mentioned experience? Is there any relationship between that and somebody's, leaving aside the values, more or less comfort zone? In other words, there's a person, I mean, we talk about type A personalities that are energetic and other personalities that are more reserved. Is there any relation, psychologically speaking, between a personality type, and I'll let you decide what those are, and their willingness to be tolerant of different points of view?
That's an interesting question. So there are differences in personality between liberals and conservatives. Liberals tend to be, as I mentioned earlier, higher in openness to experience. Conservatives seem to be a bit, if I'm remembering correctly, this is a little outside my domain because I'm a social psychologist, so this is personality psychology. They tend to be a bit higher in orderliness and potentially conscientiousness, if I'm remembering correctly. Liberals...
It would make sense if you're in favor of order as a personality type. You don't want things to change because there's already an order. It's like, we don't want this, we want things to be ordered, so I would tend to be conservative just out of the box without any politics filling it in, just stability, so to speak.
Yeah, interestingly enough as well, if you break down measures of personality into a finer tuned way, it seems that there's no relationship between political orientation and agreeableness, if I remember correctly, because agreeableness is composed of compassion and politeness, and liberals are higher in compassion than conservatives, but conservatives are higher in politeness than liberals. So there's some other differences in personality between liberals and conservatives in that way. With regards to moral beliefs, there's a very well-known theory called moral foundations theory. There's 6 moral foundations according to this theory, so they use validated questionnaires to assess these. So these are things like caring about doing harm, caring about fairness and reciprocity, caring about loyalty to your in-group.
These are individual psychology, or do they transcend that to become part of a social unit?
Well, to the degree that liberals and conservatives tend to adhere together in groups, I guess you could probably make the argument that they could potentially cohere into a social unit. But overall, so taking individual level responses and then looking at the averages, conservatives tend to care less about the harm foundation. They care about fairness, but they conceive of it differently than liberals. So they see it more as, are you getting rewards for what you've earned?
Hard work reward,
Exactly. Liberals tend to see things in more egalitarian terms, so it's more of like an equity kind of a perspective. Conservatives care more than liberals about respect for authority, in-group loyalty, and something called purity sanctity, which is really tied up with religious beliefs, like religious purity. So there's some differences between liberals and conservatives in that way too.
So even though there's this difference, there's a similarity in their ability to tolerate people that have a different value system. So we don't have a lot of time, but I'd like you to put this together with social psychology. The question is, if we create social relations or social groups such that can accent one of these values or accent these personalities, is it conceivable we could have social relations such that, in general, the tolerance, our ability to tolerate others could be more a consequence of the culture in our daily life rather than the culture that makes tribes? Is that making a larger social network, a larger social relation, social activity that kind of encourages tolerance and exchange as opposed to the tribalness?
Sure. So in social psychology, there's models with regards to how we can try to break down some of these barriers that cause differences between people and focus on the larger unit. So one of them, for example, is called the common intergroup identity model. And that model suggests that if we can get people under an umbrella with a set of shared goals, we give them some kind of equal status and equal input into a process, we can get people working together in a way that sort of decategorizes and then recategorizes them. So having shared goals, having equal status, having the opportunity to work towards things together in a social psychological lens. We disagree about these things on the fringes, and we can maybe have heated debates about how to hash it out, but at the same time, there's something we're moving towards.
You are reminding me of my 15 years as a steelworker, because one of the few places that I noticed that happened was in a union that brought together people from different ethnic, religious, social, cultural backgrounds with a shared interest in having a quality of life. We'll have to talk about that again, though, because that's all the time we have now on our program. Thank you, Dr. Wetherell, for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.